All right. So today what we'll be looking at is we're still in our unit on ecology, and we're going to be looking at environmental cycles. There are four cycles that we'll be talking about, and of course these cycles would be density independent factors. These would be abiotic factors in an ecosystem. Um, and so we're going to go through those real quick. And most of y'all actually have a really good understanding about at least two of these cycles, and the other two really aren't that difficult either. The first one is the water cycle. So basically, here what you'll have to be able to do is let me know if you know what the terms evaporation, condensation, precipitation, and transpiration mean and how to label it on an image. Of course, evaporation is whenever water will go from being a liquid on Earth's surface and evaporates and becomes a gas as water vapor um, into the atmosphere. And as that water vapor rises, it cools and condenses, and that condensation forms clouds. Of course, as the condensation occurs and it gets heavier and heavier and heavier, that cloud becomes more full and eventually it will fall as precipitation. And of course, there are a few types of that. We have rain, we have sleet, snow, hail. Um, so we have several different types there of precipitation. But then, of course, the water will it'll fall. It'll collect in rivers and streams. It even starts to break down porous rocks, which will be very important for another one of our cycles we'll talk about in a bit. Um, and then, of course, it'll go through that cycle again and evaporate again. We also have a new type known as transpiration. I say new type, but it's a term that most likely you haven't heard of. But this is basically evaporation, but now this would be from plants and trees. So being able to label that. So here's an image here. We can see we have our transpiration. That's that blue arrow coming up from the trees and plants. We have evaporation from oceans, lakes, and streams, groundwater coming up to the surface. We have condensation, precipitation, runoff, and basically that's what you'll have to be able to do there is label that those type of things and know what cycle you're looking at there. All right. The next one is the nitrogen cycle. Really, there's not that much to label on this one, but there will be some facts that you will need to know. You'll need to know, of course, the nitrogen cycle is going to be what helps move nitrogen from our atmosphere to plants, animals, bacteria, and then, of course, back to our atmosphere again. And, of course, if it's at the plants, it has to be in the soil. Two big terms we're going to have to know here is nitrogen fixation and denitrification. And the role that plays that part is bacteria. Bacteria is very important for the nitrogen cycle because our atmosphere is actually 78% nitrogen. A lot of people would think it'd be a higher amount of oxygen, but it's actually only 21% oxygen. But it is 78% nitrogen. But the nitrogen that exists in our atmosphere is basically useless to us on a terms of what we need it for. And this is where the role of bacteria comes in hand. So basically, during that precipitation and during those thunderstorms, nitrogen will actually come to the ground in a sense, and it'll fall with that rain, and then the bacteria that is on the in the soil and on the roots of plants and trees, things like that. As those roots soak up the water, the nitrogen is actually captured by that bacteria, and the bacteria undergoes what's known as nitrogen fixation. It will fix the nitrogen, it changes the nitrogen, and what it turns it into is a form of nitrogen that the plants can actually use. And then from there, now it has entered the food pyramid to where now we have our producers that have nitrogen. We have our primary consumers that eat them, secondary, tertiary, apex, and now it goes through that process. Now, of course, we know that all those organisms, whether it be the plants or the animals, the apex predators, whatever, they die eventually, and then they get broken down by bacteria and other fungus. whenever they get, or other fungi, whenever they get broken down, we have what's known as denitrification. This is whenever those organic nitrates are going to be broken down by what? By bacteria. And they release that nitrogen back as a gas to the atmosphere. So that's the circular process there of the nitrogen cycle. So what you're going to have to know here is you're going to have to know the role that the bacteria plays, not only in knowing that nitrogen fixation is how we take atmospheric nitrogen and make it usable for plants and thus making it usable for animals in the food pyramid and inside of our food system, but then also know the role of bacteria in denitrification to return those nitrates back as an atmospheric nitrogen to the atmosphere. And so here I found this image. I thought this was a good one. We notice that we have nitrogen fixation, this arrow coming down toward, due to that, that thunderstorm there, coming down towards the ground. And we have bacteria that's undergoing that nitrogen fixing to actually fix that nitrogen to make it usable. And then we see here that we've actually changed it into NH3, which would be like an ammonia. And then we start to change it back again after things have died and used it, blah blah blah. And now we're going to actually change that nitrate back into a nitrogen gas that can be released back into the atmosphere. So really the process you're going to have to know about this is nitrogen fixation and the difference there with nitrogen or denitrification. All right. The phosphorus cycle. The phosphorus cycle is actually the only one that does not occur in the atmosphere. Where we actually get the phosphorus from is we get it from rocks. Please don't forget that phosphorus, we really do need it. We need it to not only make ATP, those three phosphates there, but we also need it because they're going to help make lipids like your cell membrane. And of course, plants need it, everything needs it because they all have cell membranes and they all need ATP and they all need, they have DNA that they have to make and replicate, and all that has phosphorus on it. So that's the role that phosphorus plays in our ecosystem. So remember, like I just said, the phosphorus cycle, it comes from the weathering away of rock. So that's how the water cycle and the phosphorus cycle play that role there. So of course that would be an inorganic phosphate. It's absorbed in the soil, and guess what? We have bacteria again making that phosphate usable for plants, and then of course if it's usable for plants, then that means animals can use it as well. And then eventually those die, decay, and that's how that phosphorus cycle or that phosphorus stays in our food chain. And then it could also build back up into sediments again to be part of the rock cycle, which you would have covered in 7th and 8th grade science there. And here's a little image of it. We have rain coming down. It's going to weather away of rocks, which is going to release inorganic phosphate into the water. Then, of course, plants are going to take it up. Plants are going to then, of course, form it into an organic phosphate that can be used by plants and animals, and then they can decay, die and decay, and then, of course, they add it back to it again later on. Okay? And the last one is the carbon cycle. So the carbon cycle, we can also think of it as the carbon-oxygen cycle because they're hand in hand. In the atmosphere, carbon is attached to some oxygen known as carbon dioxide. Plants, of course, are going to use carbon dioxide, and they're going to use that to make their food during photosynthesis. Carbon dioxide, and then, of course, oxygen is released from that. So that's an example of the carbon-oxygen cycle. But we also have plant matter that's died and buried that could turn into, or we could just say organic matter that's turned into fossil fuels over millions of years, like coal and oil. And then we can burn that, and whenever we burn pretty much whenever you burn anything, you're going to release carbon dioxide. And just like I said a second ago, it releases oxygen. We use that oxygen And then we expel carbon dioxide whenever our bodies use that oxygen. So that's how the carbon and oxygen cycle play there. So, of course, we have carbon dioxide, which is in our atmosphere. Plants take it in, and whenever they take it in, they're going to release oxygen. Of course, that's where all the animals will start to use that oxygen for respiration, and then they'll, of course, breathe out carbon dioxide. That's some of the ways that carbon dioxide gets added to our atmosphere. Other ways that carbon would get added back to plant life is whenever plant life, or back to the soil or the ground, is whenever plants and animals die, and then over time could develop into fossil fuels. But remember, that takes millions and millions of years. And then anytime that we burn, whether it be a fossil fuel or just burning wood, we produce carbon dioxide, which then gets added back to the atmosphere again. And the only real problem having carbon dioxide in the atmosphere isn't a bad thing. We need greenhouse gases in our atmosphere. The problem is the amount in which they're being added back due to human impacts, because we're the only ones that are out there burning massive amounts of fossil fuels and cutting down trees and things like that. Um, so yeah, and that would be the carbon/oxygen cycle. All right, and that is it for today. Again, make sure that you look over your quizzes. If you have any questions, please ask.